The thermometer nailed to Gareth Powell's cabin wall read 18 degrees above zero, while the identical instrument hanging from a tree 30 yards away showed 15 below. The difference of 33 degrees between his cabin and the surrounding Montana wilderness would seem impossible to other mountain men until they understood what the Welsh trapper had built above his head. Before we go further, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if you appreciate stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. The morning of January 12, 1839, Gareth Powell woke to silence. The fire had died sometime during the night, reduced to gray ash that held no warmth. His breath formed clouds in the air inside the cabin. That was normal for a Montana winter. What wasn't normal was the absolute stillness from the bunk across the small room where Rhys Owen should have been stirring. Gareth knew before he crossed the frozen dirt floor. He had seen death enough times in 7 years of mountain trapping to recognize its particular quality of motionlessness. Rhys lay on his side facing the wall, still wrapped in his buffalo robe and wool blankets. His face had the waxy pallor of frozen flesh. Gareth touched his partner's neck and found skin cold as stone. Rhys Owen, who had survived knife fights with hostile Blackfeet warriors, who had once killed a wolverine with his bare hands when his rifle misfired, who could read weather patterns like other men read books, had frozen to death in his sleep less than 8 feet from the fireplace. The cabin was well built by mountain standards. Gareth and Rhys had constructed it the previous summer using solid pine logs, careful notching, and thick moss chinking. They had built a proper stone fireplace, not just a fire pit. They had made the structure tight against wind. They had done everything right, according to the practices every trapper knew and followed. And Rhys had died anyway. Gareth spent that day in a fog of grief and practicality. He couldn't bury Rhys. The ground was frozen solid 3 feet down. Instead, he wrapped his partner's body in canvas and secured it in the small lean-to attached to the cabin's north wall. The cold would preserve the body until spring, when the earth thawed enough for a proper grave. He rebuilt the fire and sat watching flames consume split pine logs while his mind replayed the previous night over and over, searching for what he might have done differently. The fire had been substantial when they went to sleep. Gareth remembered banking it carefully with ash to make the coals last through the night. But sometime in the cold hours before dawn, those coals had died. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped. Gareth had survived because he was younger and stronger, his body better able to maintain core temperature. Rhys, at 53 years old and worn down by hard seasons, had simply stopped generating enough heat. His body temperature had fallen gradually while he slept. He never woke up. Over the next 3 days, Gareth remained in the cabin, leaving only to gather firewood. He kept the fire burning constantly, feeding it far more wood than usual. He was afraid now in a way he had never been afraid before. The wilderness held obvious dangers like grizzly bears, hostile encounters, accidents with axes or rifles. Those dangers you could see and prepare for. But this new fear was different. It was the realization that the shelter he had trusted, the cabin he had helped build with confidence and care, was fundamentally inadequate. It could not protect him from the simple physical reality of Montana winter cold. On the 4th day, Gareth forced himself to think systematically about the problem. Gareth began his investigation by simply observing. He fed the fireplace steadily and watched what happened to the heat it produced. The stones warmed and radiated warmth into the room. The air nearest the fire became comfortable, almost hot. But 3 feet away from the hearth, the temperature dropped noticeably. At the far wall, near where Rhys had died, the air was cold enough to frost breath. The cabin was only 12 feet across. The fire was substantial, yet somehow the heat disappeared before it could warm the entire space. He examined the walls carefully. The logs were solid pine, 10 to 12 inches thick. The notching at the corners was tight. The chinking between logs was packed with moss and mud, applied carefully the previous summer. By every standard Gareth knew, these walls should hold heat. But when he placed his hand against the interior log surface, he could feel cold radiating inward from outside. The wood itself was conducting the freezing exterior temperature directly into the cabin. Over the next week, Gareth conducted experiments that other trappers would have considered wasteful or insane. He let the fire die completely and measured how quickly the cabin cooled. It took less than 2 hours for the interior temperature to match the outside air. He rebuilt the fire and timed how long it took to warm the space. Nearly an hour to raise the temperature enough to stop his breath from showing. He tried covering sections of wall with extra blankets and buffalo robes, creating insulated patches. Those sections did radiate less cold, but the effect was minimal. The problem became clear through this systematic observation. Heat was escaping the cabin through multiple pathways simultaneously. It conducted directly through the log walls. It radiated from the warm interior surfaces to the cold exterior. It convected away as wind blew across the outside of the logs, constantly cooling the wood and pulling heat through. And most importantly, the heat loss was continuous. Even with a roaring fire, the cabin was fighting a losing battle against the cold surrounding it. Gareth thought about caves. He had sheltered in caves during sudden storms, and always noticed they stayed warmer than open air, even without fires. Caves had thick stone walls, but more importantly, they had protected airspace around them. Wind couldn't reach the cave entrance directly. The air inside the cave mouth stayed relatively still, creating an insulating layer between the deep interior and the outside world. He thought about his own winter clothing. He wore multiple layers, not because thick cloth was warm, but because the air trapped between layers provided insulation. The principle was simple but profound. Still, air was an excellent insulator. Moving air was a heat thief. Any surface exposed to wind would lose heat rapidly. Any surface protected from wind would hold heat longer. The solution began forming in his mind, though he didn't yet understand all its implications. He needed to stop wind from touching his cabin walls. He needed to create protected airspace around the structure. He needed to build something that would stand between his living space and the brutal Montana cold, a buffer zone that would break the direct connection between interior warmth and exterior freeze. Spring came late in 1839. Gareth buried Reese on a hillside above the creek in early May when the ground finally thawed. He marked the grave with stones and spent 3 days completing the season's remaining trap work, then packed his furs and headed for Fort Benton. The journey took 2 weeks on horseback. During those long days of travel, Gareth thought constantly about cabin construction and heat retention. Fort Benton was a bustling trading post on the Missouri River, the primary market for furs in that region. Gareth sold his pelts for a modest profit, but instead of spending his earnings on the usual supplies, he did something that drew attention and ridicule. He purchased 300 board feet of milled planking. The lumber had been shipped upriver from St. Louis at considerable expense. Most trappers considered it an absurd luxury. Logs were free in the mountains. Why pay premium prices for planks? Gareth also bought 2 mercury thermometers in glass tubes, instruments typically used by army doctors or Eastern scientists. Each thermometer cost more than a month's worth of coffee and tobacco. The trader who sold them asked what possible use a mountain man had for precision temperature measurement. Gareth didn't explain. He simply paid and added the fragile instruments to his supplies. Other trappers in the fort noticed his purchases. Word spread quickly through the small frontier community. The Welsh trapper who lost his partner was buying enough finished lumber to build a house frame and scientific instruments like some kind of natural philosopher. Men started asking questions. What was he building? Why did he need thermometers? Gareth gave vague answers about improving his cabin and wanting to understand cold better. This only increased the speculation and mockery. A grizzled trapper named Cooper told him directly that he was wasting money. Lumber was for settlements and towns. Mountain men built with logs and rawhide, and whatever materials the wilderness provided for free. Spending hard-earned fur money on milled planks was foolish, possibly even cowardly. Real trappers didn't need fancy materials to survive winters. They just needed toughness and a good fire. Gareth listened to the criticism without arguing. He knew his plans would sound even more ridiculous if he tried to explain them. How could he tell these men that he intended to build a wooden structure above and around his cabin to trap air and block wind? They would think he had lost his mind to grief. So he kept his reasoning private, loaded his supplies onto 2 pack horses, and left Fort Benton in early June. He returned to the mountains and immediately began scouting for a new cabin location. He found what he wanted on a south-facing slope near a reliable creek. The spot received direct sunlight for most of the day during winter months. The ground drained well. Sight lines were clear in all directions. Most importantly, the location was protected from prevailing north winds by a slight rise in terrain behind it. Gareth spent 3 days clearing the site and preparing to build something no mountain man had attempted before. Gareth began construction in mid-June 1839. The first week was devoted entirely to the foundation, something most mountain men skipped completely. He dug a shallow trench outlining the cabin's perimeter, 18 feet long by 14 feet wide. Into this trench he placed flat stones, carefully leveling them to create a uniform base. The foundation would prevent ground moisture from wicking into the bottom logs and would keep the structure from settling unevenly over time. For the walls, Gareth selected logs with obsessive precision. He rejected trees with excessive taper, knots, or irregular growth patterns. He wanted uniform pine logs approximately 11 inches in diameter. Most trappers used whatever trees were convenient and closest to their building site. Gareth walked miles through the surrounding forest, marking specific trees, then spent 2 weeks felling and hauling only those he had selected. He stripped every log completely using a draw knife, removing all bark and shaping the surface smooth. The process was exhausting. Each log required hours of careful work. But Gareth understood that bark created irregular gaps between logs and would compress over time, opening spaces for air infiltration. Stripped logs of consistent diameter could be fitted together with minimal separation. The corner construction used traditional saddle notching, but Gareth cut the notches with unusual precision. He tested each joint multiple times, shaving away tiny amounts of wood until the fit was nearly perfect. Where most trappers completed corner notching in an hour or 2, Gareth spent half a day on each corner, ensuring the logs locked together with almost no movement or gap. Between each log, he applied chinking that was far superior to standard moss and mud. He had developed a mixture of clay, shredded bark fiber, and rendered animal fat. The clay provided body and adhesion. The bark fiber reinforced it against cracking. The animal fat made it flexible and somewhat waterproof. He prepared this mixture in large batches, boiling the components together over his campfire until they formed a thick paste. As each log was positioned, Gareth packed the chinking mixture into every gap, working it deep into the spaces between logs with a flat stick. He smoothed the exterior surface carefully, creating a seal that was both airtight and weatherproof. The interior received the same treatment. Every crack, every irregularity, every potential pathway for air movement was sealed completely. The cabin walls rose slowly. A traditional structure would be completed in 4 or 5 days with 2 men working. Gareth worked alone and took 3 full weeks just to raise the walls to their final height of 7 logs. Other trappers passing through the area stopped to watch and offer unsolicited commentary. They saw a man wasting time on unnecessary precision. They didn't understand that Gareth was building the inner shell of a 2-part system. The walls were excellent by any standard, tight and solid and well constructed, but they were only the beginning. The real innovation would come next, when Gareth began building outward instead of upward. With the basic cabin completed in early August, Gareth began work on what he called the thermal shell. Other trappers who saw what he was building called it madness. He started by extending the roof structure outward in a way that defied conventional cabin design. Where a normal roof overhang might project 18 inches to shed rain away from walls, Gareth's design extended 12 feet from the cabin's south and west faces. He began with the support framework. He sank 4 massive pine posts into the ground, each post 14 inches thick and 10 feet tall. These posts were positioned 12 feet out from the cabin wall, creating a perimeter for the extended structure. He buried each post 3 feet deep, packing stones and earth around the base for stability. The posts had to be strong enough to support significant weight through winter snow accumulation. Across the top of these posts, Gareth laid heavy horizontal beams, each beam a full log 10 inches in diameter. These beams connected the posts to each other and to the cabin's existing roof structure. The engineering required careful measurement and multiple adjustments. The beams had to be level and had to align precisely with the cabin's roof line. He used rope and pulley systems to lift the beams into position, working alone with methodical patience. Once the perimeter beams were secured, Gareth installed crossbeams running from the cabin wall to the outer beam. He spaced these crossbeams 18 inches apart, creating a rigid framework that would support the roof layers above. Each crossbeam was notched where it met the cabin wall and the outer perimeter, creating locked joints that distributed weight across the entire structure. The result was a massive covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the cabin. The space beneath this framework was protected from precipitation and wind. More importantly, it created exactly what Gareth wanted, a buffer zone of still air between his cabin walls and the open environment. Wind could no longer strike the cabin walls directly. Rain and snow could no longer touch the logs. The walls would stay dry and protected. But Gareth wasn't finished. The covered porch alone would provide some benefit, but his design went further. Above the framework, he began constructing the roof itself, and this was where his purchased lumber became essential. He laid milled planks across the crossbeams, creating a solid decking. The planks were fitted tightly together, their milled edges allowing precise joining that rough-hewn logs could never achieve. Over the planking, he spread layers of birch bark for waterproofing, then added split wooden shingles in overlapping rows. The roof sloped gently away from the cabin, ensuring water drainage while maintaining enough pitch to shed snow. The entire structure was overbuilt by frontier standards, using 3 times the materials a normal roof required. Standing back to examine his work, Gareth saw other trappers shaking their heads. He had used more lumber on this extended roof than most men used for entire cabins, but the framework was only half complete. The most distinctive element of Gareth's design emerged in September as he began constructing what would become known as the stepped wings. Above the solid roof decking, he built a secondary structure that appeared decorative but served crucial thermodynamic purposes. Using his milled planking, he created rows of wooden slats that extended outward and upward from the roof surface in a cascading pattern. The first row of slats was mounted 18 inches above the main roof deck, supported by short vertical posts. Each slat was 6 inches wide and positioned with a 2-inch gap between it and the next. The row extended the full length of the overhang, creating a slatted barrier that allowed air movement but broke up wind flow. Above this first row, Gareth installed a second row, offset by half a slat width, so the gaps in the upper row didn't align with gaps in the lower row. He continued this pattern upward, building 5 rows of offset slats that created a stepped, wing-like appearance. Each row was slightly further back than the one below, creating an angled profile that rose from the outer edge of the overhang back toward the cabin. The visual effect was striking, almost architectural, like wooden waves frozen in mid-motion, but the appearance was secondary to function. The stepped slat structure created multiple chambers of trapped air between each layer. Air warmed by sunlight on the dark wood during the day would rise through these chambers, warming the wood above it in a convective cycle. At night, the multiple layers would slow heat radiation from the cabin, creating a graduated temperature transition from the warm interior to the cold exterior. Wind striking the structure would be broken up and deflected, unable to penetrate directly to the roof deck below. Gareth selected the darkest wood available for the slats, choosing pine with heavy resin content that had weathered to deep brown. Dark surfaces absorb solar radiation more efficiently than light surfaces. During winter days, even weak sunlight would warm the exposed slats, and that warmth would transfer to the air trapped in the chambers below. The construction required mathematical precision unusual for frontier building. Each slat had to be positioned at exactly the same angle and spacing as all the others. The vertical supports had to be uniform height. The offset pattern had to be maintained consistently across the entire structure. Gareth worked with plumbline and measuring string, checking and rechecking each element before securing it permanently. Other trappers who visited found the stepped wings baffling. One man asked if Gareth was building a church. Another suggested he was trying to make his cabin fly. A third simply stated that it was the strangest waste of good lumber he had ever witnessed. Gareth explained the principle of trapped air and graduated thermal zones, but his explanations were met with skepticism. Heat was heat, and cold was cold. Building wooden decorations above your roof wouldn't change basic reality. By late September, the stepped wing structure was complete, rising above the overhang like an elaborate wooden sculpture. The first serious cold arrived in early November 1839. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees below zero, and Gareth prepared to test his thermal overhang system with scientific precision. He mounted one thermometer inside the cabin near the center of the room, one under the covered overhang area against the exterior cabin wall, and one outside in open air 30 yards from the structure, hanging from a tree branch at the same height as the others. The results exceeded even his optimistic expectations. With a moderate fire burning in the fireplace, the interior thermometer read 48 degrees. The thermometer under the overhang, protected by the buffer zone but not heated directly, read 32 degrees. The exterior thermometer in open air read 15 below zero. The difference between inside and outside was 63 degrees. More importantly, the buffer zone was maintaining a temperature 33 degrees warmer than the surrounding environment without any direct heat source. Gareth began recording measurements 3 times daily, dawn, midday, and dusk. The pattern remained consistent. The covered space beneath, the overhang, stayed significantly warmer than the open air. During daylight hours, when sun struck the dark wooden slats of the stepped wings, the buffer zone temperature increased even further. The wood absorbed solar radiation and transferred that warmth to the trapped air below. On clear winter days, the overhang area sometimes reached 40 degrees, while outside, air remained well below zero. The thermal performance improved as winter deepened. Snow accumulated on top of the stepped wing structure, adding another insulating layer. The weight was substantial, but Gareth's overbuilt framework supported it easily. The snow created additional dead air spaces between the slats, enhancing the insulation effect. More importantly, the snow-covered structure prevented heat from radiating upward into the night sky, trapping warmth close to the cabin. Inside the cabin, Gareth noticed immediate practical benefits. He used approximately half the firewood he had burned the previous winter. The fireplace could maintain comfortable interior temperatures with smaller, less frequent fires. The cabin stayed warm enough overnight that the fire could die to coals without creating dangerous cold. Morning temperatures inside rarely dropped below freezing, even when exterior temperatures reached 20 or 30 below zero. The walls themselves stayed warmer. Protected from wind and precipitation by the overhang, the exterior log surfaces maintained higher temperatures than exposed wood. This reduced the temperature differential between inside and outside wall surfaces, which reduced the rate of heat conduction through the logs. The chinking remained flexible and intact because it wasn't subjected to repeated freeze-thaw cycles that destroyed exposed chinking on standard cabins. By December, Gareth was confident the system worked as designed. He had created a cabin that maintained a livable interior temperature with minimal fuel consumption, using passive architectural features to trap and manage heat. The stepped thermal overhang wasn't decorative or wasteful. It was functional engineering disguised as unusual construction. But convincing other trappers would require more than thermometer readings. It would require them to witness the difference between his thermal shell and their standard cabins under the most brutal conditions winter could provide. Word of Gareth's unusual cabin spread through the scattered trapping community during the winter of 1839 to 1840. Trappers traveling through the region made detours to see the structure with the stepped wooden wings. Most arrived skeptical and left unconvinced. The building looked strange, almost comical with its elaborate overhang and layered slat construction. It didn't look like something that belonged in the mountains. A trapper named Hutchins visited in late December and examined the thermometers with open suspicion. He stood under the overhang and admitted the space felt warmer than open air, but he attributed this to wind protection, nothing more. When Gareth explained the principle of trapped air chambers and graduated thermal zones, Hutchins shook his head. Heat rose. Everyone knew that. Building wooden layers above your roof just gave the heat more ways to escape upward. The whole design contradicted common sense. Another visitor, a French-Canadian trapper called LeBlanc, suggested that Gareth had positioned his thermometers dishonestly to create false readings. Perhaps the interior thermometer was too close to the fireplace. Perhaps the exterior thermometer was in an unusually cold microclimate. Perhaps the buffer zone thermometer was receiving residual heat from the cabin through some hidden pathway. Gareth offered to let LeBlanc position the thermometers himself anywhere he chose. LeBlanc declined and left, muttering about Welsh eccentricity. The most common criticism was simple pragmatism. Even if the thermal overhang worked exactly as Gareth claimed, was the result worth the effort? He had spent 3 months building something that could have been completed in a week. He had used 300 board feet of expensive milled lumber plus countless hours of labor. He had created a structure so elaborate it required constant explanation. For what? To use half as much firewood? Firewood was free. Any trapper could cut more whenever needed. Gareth tried explaining that the benefit wasn't just fuel efficiency, it was safety. A cabin that stayed warm with minimal fire was a cabin where you wouldn't freeze if you got sick or injured and couldn't maintain the hearth. It was a cabin where you could sleep through the night without waking to feed flames. It was a cabin that eliminated the specific danger that had killed Rhys Owen. But these arguments failed to persuade men who had survived multiple winters using traditional methods. By January, Gareth stopped trying to convince anyone. He simply lived in his cabin, recorded his temperature measurements, and observed how the thermal overhang performed through varying conditions. During blizzards, when wind howled across the mountains, his cabin remained quiet and warm. During clear, cold snaps, when temperatures dropped to 40 below, his interior space stayed above freezing with minimal fire. The system worked, whether other trappers believed in it or not. Then Morgan Davies nearly died, and everything changed. The incident that would validate Gareth's design happened on the night of January 28, 1840, 12 miles from Gareth's cabin, in a structure built using every traditional technique the trapping community trusted. Morgan Davies was an experienced trapper, 41 years old, with 9 winters in the mountains behind him. His cabin was well constructed by standard practices: tight notching, good chinking, solid door, proper fireplace. On the evening of January 28, 1840, He banked his fire carefully before sleeping, just as he had done hundreds of times before. He went to bed confident the coals would last until morning. Sometime during the night, the fire died completely. The exact cause was never determined. Perhaps a downdraft from unusual wind conditions smothered the coals. Perhaps Morgan had misjudged the banking and used too much ash. Perhaps the wood was slightly damp and failed to maintain combustion. Whatever the reason, the fire went out, and the cabin began losing heat immediately. Morgan woke near dawn, confused and dangerously cold. The cabin interior had dropped below zero. His blankets were stiff with frost from his frozen breath. His fingers were numb and clumsy. He tried to rebuild the fire, but his cold, stiffened hands couldn't manage the flint and steel. He dropped the flint twice. His vision was blurring. He recognized the symptoms of severe hypothermia from having seen it in other men. He had minutes, not hours. He forced himself to move. He pulled on his heaviest coat, though his fingers barely functioned well enough to manage it. He stumbled out of the cabin into the pre-dawn darkness. The exterior temperature was 30 below zero, but moving generated some body heat. Standing still in the frozen cabin meant death. He started walking toward where he remembered Gareth's cabin was located, 12 miles southeast. Morgan walked for 3 hours through snow and brutal cold. He fell twice and barely managed to stand again. His thinking was clouded and slow. He wasn't sure he was traveling in the right direction. He wasn't sure of anything except that stopping meant freezing. When he finally saw smoke rising from Gareth's chimney in the distance, he felt overwhelming relief, followed immediately by the fear that he wouldn't make it the final half-mile. Gareth found him collapsed 50 yards from the cabin. Morgan was conscious but unable to speak coherently. His exposed skin showed white patches of frostbite. His core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. Gareth half carried him inside and began the careful process of warming someone suffering from severe hypothermia. Too much heat, too quickly, could be fatal. He wrapped Morgan in blankets and gave him warm water to drink in small amounts. Morgan spent 2 days recovering in Gareth's cabin. During that time, he noticed the interior temperature, the lack of drafts, the comfortable warmth maintained with what seemed like a modest fire. He asked about the thermometers and read the measurements himself. He walked outside to compare the exterior temperature to the buffer zone beneath the overhang. The 33-degree difference was undeniable when experienced directly. On the 3rd day, Morgan asked Gareth to help him rebuild his cabin using the thermal overhang design. He had nearly died because his shelter couldn't protect him when his fire failed. Gareth spent 3 weeks in February 1840 helping Morgan Davies construct a thermal overhang system around a new cabin. Morgan had abandoned his previous structure, unwilling to risk another night in a building he no longer trusted. The new cabin incorporated every principle Gareth had developed: precise log fitting, superior chinking, and most importantly, the extended overhang with stepped wooden wings that created protective thermal zones. Word of Morgan's near-death experience and his decision to adopt Gareth's design spread through the trapping community with more impact than any explanation of thermal principles could have achieved. Other trappers began asking serious questions instead of offering mockery. How much lumber was required? What was the construction sequence? Could the overhang be added to an existing cabin, or did it require new construction? Gareth answered every question and offered to help anyone who wanted to build similar structures. Over the next 3 years, variations of the thermal overhang appeared across the northern Rockies. Some trappers built simplified versions with basic overhangs and no stepped wings. Others attempted to replicate Gareth's full design, but lacked his precision and patience. A few improved on his concepts, adding features like reflective metal sheets under the overhang to redirect heat or adjustable vents to control air circulation. The specific implementations varied based on available materials, individual skill, and understanding of the underlying principles. But the core idea spread: creating protected airspace around a cabin improved thermal performance more effectively than simply building thicker walls. The fur trade collapsed in the mid-1840s. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction in many regions, and fashion had shifted away from fur felt hats toward silk. Trappers abandoned the mountains in large numbers, heading to Oregon, California, or back to eastern settlements. Gareth left in 1847, selling his furs for the last time and using his savings to purchase land in the Willamette Valley. He married a widow named Catherine in 1849, raised her 2 children alongside 3 of his own, and operated a small but successful grain farm. He never spoke much about his trapping years. When neighbors asked about his past, he described it simply as hard work in cold country. He didn't mention Reese Owen's death or the cabin he had built in response to that loss. He didn't claim credit for the thermal overhang designs that continued spreading through frontier communities long after he left the mountains. To his family and neighbors in Oregon, he was just a Welsh farmer with a quiet disposition and careful work habits. Gareth Powell died in 1873 at age 61, following a brief illness. He was buried in a cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone listed his name, birth and death years, and the phrase faithful husband and father. No mention of Montana or mountain trapping or innovative construction techniques appeared on the marker. But in the mountains he had left. Behind, cabins with extended overhangs and stepped wooden wings still stood, weathered but functional, protecting miners, hunters, and settlers who never knew the name of the Welsh trapper who had invented them.